coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I really think this is about an attitude change on the state legislative level. It's about, instead of thinking, okay, here's what we've been appropriating to universities, for years, it's why should we be appropriating money to universities that are in violation of the Constitution, in violation of federal law, and have all of these pernicious effects and have lost the trust of the American people? No, you university, reform yourself, come back to me with data showing me that what I'm funding is worthwhile. I really do think that this is a necessary attitude change, and it's going to it is happening on the federal level. It would be good if it was happening on the state level too, because like I said, once they have federal funding threatened, they're going to come hat in hand to the state legislatures.
Welcome everyone once again to the Roundtable, although this is a special series of the Roundtable, which we're calling the Cincinnatus Series, which will run for just a few weeks here. And we wanted it to be a bit of a guide for state legislators and what they can do to reform higher education policy around their states. It's something that my guests know a lot about, I'll introduce them. We have Scott Yenor, my colleague at the Center for the American Way of Life in Washington, D.C., although Scott is a roving higher ed reform maestro. He's our senior director of state coalitions, where he's worked with Florida and Texas and many other states, and many more to come, on what they ought to do about the problem of higher education and its increasing ideological and anti-American character in recent decades. We're also joined by Inez Stepman, who's the senior policy analyst, or a senior policy and legal analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Inez was also a former Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute. And we have David Azerrad, who was a Publius Fellow at the Claremont Institute, now back in the mists of time, and soon to be a naturalized American citizen, although, as we keep joking, he's been a great American for a long time, as a proud gun owner and now married to an American. David's day job is at Hillsdale College in D.C. and is a frequent teacher at the Claremont Institute's summer fellowship programs. So we wanted to talk about education reform. We'll be talking about family policy and other episodes, and more topics that state legislatures ought to be taking up in a somewhat transformed national political environment with the election of the second Trump administration. But we wanted to start with this topic of education. Scott, maybe we could just start with you. What do you think are the biggest opportunities that you've seen in your work in recent years for state legislators? We can start very generally and then descend to some specifics.
Yeah, the thing that I think is happening most around the states is that people are recognizing the problem in the legislatures, and they're looking for ways of dealing with it from the legislative branch. Um, there's also a recognition, I think, that they don't have very friendly boards of trustees or boards of education to actually accomplish the things that need to be accomplished. So they're starting to pay more attention to appointments and the importance of those appointments for actually achieving anything in higher education reform. It's difficult to run universities from the legislature. So, the first thing that I think people are very much becoming aware of is the mistakes they have made in just filling seats on these boards of education with people from the American elite, from the education establishment, and beginning to slowly turn that ship around and finding people who are interested in higher education reform on the boards of trustees. And really, without that being done, legislatures are going to be spinning their wheels. And so it's going to be a long-term project of reconstituting the boards that run these institutions. In that way, I think it's very much part of what the Claremont Institute has been about. It's an administrative state problem. And we've taken the job of running these universities and given it to boards of trustees. And that's really the first step, I think, in any kind of intelligent reform over the long haul.
Yeah, what's been the traditional composition of these boards in recent decades, and what's the best thing to change? I mean, other than just getting in your people, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I think it is that's part of it is getting in your people. I mean, the way boards have run is that the more prestigious the university, the more big donors fill the boards. And the more big donors fill the boards, the less they're interested in reform and the more they're interested in boosterism when it comes to the school. And their identities are closely tied to the elite schools that they have come from. And I think just putting one or two reformers on a state board is going to change the composition of what is going on and will change the concerns and will actually educate the people who are on these boards about their potential to be those who are leading in reforms and then some ideas on how they could do it. Um, I think it's pretty smart to put people who've been experienced in academia on those boards. That is, I think those are the best people who know where the bodies are buried and what could be done given the current structure of the universities. So I don't think it requires a wholesale turnover, but I do think it requires a couple of intelligent placements of reformers onto those boards.
Can I add something to that,
Please.
Ryan? I used to work at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, which is a small higher ed reform group in DC, whose business model was to try to get the trustees to do something about higher ed reform. And the two things I noticed, the two dominant emotions in the souls of trustees that are really an impediment to reform are awe and intimidation. Awe at these universities are so wonderful. They're so awesome. I remember them so fondly. And then intimidation, i.e., I barely have a BA. These people seem really smart. I should defer to them. And I think, on the whole, there should be a lot more hostility mixed with some contempt for the overall corruption of the American higher education system. So you don't want mindless people to go in and just throw bombs, but you want them to have the self-confidence to stand up to the professors, the deans, the provost, and realize that not all of them, but Scott and Inez can probably back me up, the majority of them are charlatans. Like, these are not genuinely educated people. Their scholarship is bogus. The universities are corrupt, and that you cannot be as credentialed as the people in the university you're overseeing, and that shouldn't affect your self-confidence.
Yeah, that's a good point. We if the last 8 years, let alone the last 28 years, should have taught us anything, it's to be dubious of the official, both state-based and national judgments of expertise. And higher education, this has been it's been corrupted now for the better part of a century, although really more aggressively for 40 or 50 years by the education schools. And I remember I had a conversation 20 years ago in Washington when I was maybe 22 years ago when I was interning there. I was just at some bar and I had suggested that I might want to teach. And the typical DC bureaucrat consultant type, she was in education, it turned out, and she said, well, do you have an education degree? And I threw I stifled my mocking laughter and tried to throw some cold water on the notion that you needed a specialized degree in education to be able to teach well. And she found this a very hostile and absurd thing to say, but it's certainly true at the state level. What qualities would you look for, Scott or Inez, in a good board member? I mean, Scott, you said loyalty and I guess allegiance to the plans for reform, either issuing out of governor's office or out of like-minded state legislators. And you said, Scott, that they should have some familiarity with academia. And I guess the last, maybe one or two of the last qualities would be courage. Anything everyone should really be looking for besides those things?
I mean, I'll leave it to Scott mostly to answer this because he is coming from within academia. But I think the quality of contempt that David is referencing is really important. Actually, it's a contempt backed by the American people. If you look at polls, particularly since 2015, there's just been respect for universities as an institution has fallen off a cliff, and it's not just fallen off a cliff with the right. It's fallen off the cliff with like basically all moderates as well, who are following the same trajectory. The only people who are enthusiastic, about the state of our universities are basically people on the hard left, and that's about it. So that confidence going in, knowing, especially in the state context, right? If you're talking about public funds from the state going to public universities, understand that you're representing people who agree with you overwhelmingly, that these are not institutions that deserve that kind of deference and respect that David was talking about. I have some thoughts about the legislative side, but I'll maybe Scott has better ideas of the quality of such people who could be on these boards, because not coming from academia, and but possessing the appropriate contempt. I think he would probably know better.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that overall general attitude of skepticism or contempt, I guess, as you guys call it. Um, I do think that conservative academics are among the most red-pilled and black-pilled human beings in the world. And I'm not saying I know all of them because there's an annual conference where we meet in a closet every year, but I think I know every one of them. And and so finding places for especially experienced, tenured conservatives in academia to serve on boards, I think, is one way to build the skepticism, and that's what I meant when I said that you got to know where the bodies are buried. You got to know where the pain points are on the universities.
Mm.
And universities have a very special and strange way of operating. And those of us who've been around for a couple decades on higher education campuses, I think really know a lot more about that than your average trustee. We also know how easy it is to manipulate the boards because, if you don't get the agenda for a board before an hour before the meeting, you're not going to be able to ask any intelligent questions, do the homework, or actually know what the homework is. So yeah, I think you want someone motivated, but not necessarily experienced as members of boards, but rather experienced within these institutions to figure out what to do.
And Scott, you touched on the quality I wanted to add is you got to be inquisitive and tenacious. You should ask questions and then not relent until you get an answer. Like, what actually is the 4-year graduation rate? What is the 6-year graduation rate? Where's the money being spent? And they may or they may not respond. And if they don't, you shouldn't relent. Like, you need to obtain basic data. And sometimes, if you just look at the basic data, things become quite clear. Like, you look at the graduation rates, you look at the ratio of administrators to faculties and its evolution over time. And if they don't have the data, ask them to produce it. I mean, at the end of the day, they're working for you. They should be able to produce the data. So you got to be inquisitive and tenacious and demand answers to very basic questions about the health and operations of the institution.
Can I add to what David is saying, that there's a
Please.
role for the state legislatures in doing exactly that? The first and easiest thing is to humiliate the presidents of these universities, and perhaps some of the board members, by bringing them before the legislature. Every state legislature has an appropriations. A appropriations like discussion, right? Every year, most of these things are basically rolled over from the previous budget, except more money, right? But that is talking about pain points. There's going to be a number of pain points coming down the pike for universities, and I think they know that, right? First of all, federal policy is going to be, if it's certainly not going to be as favorable as it has been for the last 30 to 40 years. It may be actively hostile. Let's hope so. But I think they're going to be looking at actively losing a lot of their grants and perhaps access to student loan funds from the federal government. That is the lifeblood of most of these universities. And the second half of their lifeblood, if they're public universities, is coming from the state legislature. So the state legislature has enormous power to apply those pain points. Oh, and I forgot to add, there's a natural demographic slump, right? So we have too many universities. Gen Z is a small generation. Gen Alpha is going to be even smaller, right? So that we simply have too many universities. There's not going to be a lot of these universities are going to close in the next 5 to 10 years. That's my prediction. They cannot keep their business model running without ample federal funds, generous donations from the state legislature, and a supply of kids who are going to think that it's worth it to pay $100,000 to get one of these degrees. And I just think all three of those things are going to be on the decline. So we're going to see a lot of universities buckle under that pressure. We should be using that. The state legislature should feel free to demand the kind of data that David is talking about. They should be bringing these presidents. The presidents should be worried every day about when they have to appear before the state legislature, and they should start to behave accordingly. There's probably a huge role for the state legislatures in actually enforcing some of, for example, Trump's DEI, anti-DEI EOs about federal money. State legislatures can point over here, over here. It's being violated right here in our public universities, and they can apply their own strings to that money. So they have a lot of power if they decide to use it.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So the state legislatures should be on the lookout maybe for what the feds are doing and copying that or augmenting it to the extent that it's useful and advancing their priorities.
I actually one more add one more
Yeah,
point. I think we're seeing this on the federal level just in the first couple weeks of the Trump administration. Most of this was a matter of pure political will. The tools are there, the leverage points are there, the pain points are there to get what we want out of universities. But it's a pure matter of political will. And just to demonstrate with a little story, David worked for ACTA many years ago. I worked for ALEC many years ago, which is a state legislative organization, right? Um, and some of my legislators would tell me stories like, um, for example, that the Republican Party would have to go begging hat in hand in a lot of these, even red states, for a Republican who was willing to chair the education committee, right? Because this was simply something Republicans were not interested in doing. And lo and behold, the education committees basically rubber stamped more and more money, more and more diversity requirements, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that was the left's agenda, and we left it completely to Democrats to run our higher education system in the states. So I would hope that that attitude is changing. If it's not changed already, it should be. It should happen tomorrow. That there should be somebody who wants to make their career by being on the education committee in the states, and holding these universities accountable, because I think it's a popular thing to do. It's an important thing to do, hopefully we are past the miserable 30 years where Republicans didn't think that education in this country was something worth fighting for.
yeah. So the in-state legislatures, step one, really, in the coming months, or as soon as possible, ahead of your next session, or even during your current one, would be to identify that enthusiastic and intelligent and tenacious education committee chair, I would think. Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about our experience with Texas A&M? I mean, it's sort of, or Texas's experience with A&M, which we did some reports on the state of DEI at Texas A&M and other institutions in Texas. But what actions were taken, and what was the response, and how do you stay tenacious with your, you're a state legislature. You have a lot of, you are in control of the pain points that is funding, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of ways for your institutions of higher education to pull the wool over your eyes and evade your dictates.
Yeah, so I think there's been two models for how to, approach reforming higher education. There's been the governor initiated model, which Governor DeSantis in Florida is a great representative of that. In Texas, the governor hasn't been as interested in higher ed reform. He's really pushed school choice at the K through 12 level, Governor Abbott. And there, the leadership has come from the legislature. One of the places that Inez was talking about, where the legislators have taken the bulls by the horns and done a lot of the work. So we at Claremont did this kind of 50-page report on DEI at Texas A&M over the last 50 years, but maybe it was really focused on the last 30 years. And showed how it had sewn itself into the operations of the administration, into hiring, into student recruitment, into constructing the campus climate. and we released this thing, and and we put one on the seat of every legislator in the Texas legislature, and Senator Creighton was very interested in what was going on, and he picked up the issue and carried it, mastered it, and Texas passed the most intelligent anti-DEI bill from a legislative point of view. Um, that has been passed, I think, up to this point. Not only getting rid of diversity statements, but also like having a really good accountability system, putting it on the boards of regents to go about after the DEI, allowing the attorney general to go after and take causes of action against universities that hadn't done it. And within 6 months, um, the president resigned, and a new president was hired, who was put in charge of making sure that A&M, stayed on top of reversing course on these matters. In Texas, A&M is one of these crown jewels universities, one of the really best public universities in the country, has a pretty conservative student body, and therefore the left has taken to an unrelenting attack on it in order to try to destroy its sinews, and change its culture. And while the students are still, I think, as they were about 50 years ago, the faculty and the attitude of the place is much different. So now, like that has taken place, it's become, people have become aware of the importance of getting boards of regents that are actually on board with maintaining the missions of place. They've asked, well, how did this happen here in College Station? And so now I think there's a certain ethic change where it's going to take more than just being a donor to get onto the Texas A&M Board of Regents, and they're going to, be appointing people who are interested in maintaining the place over the long haul. So I think it's one of the great examples of places that have been reformed through laws, and there's still a lot more work to be done. But Senator Creighton has new priorities this term that we're helping with, that will change general education at Texas A&M, and then there's also hope of having one of these centers on campus that have been popping up all over the place. So I think it's a good model that has happened, and that we've been involved with over the course of time.
You've mentioned Florida and the governor-led approach in Texas. Are there any other states that have done good work in this field that should serve as examples? I mean, we're talking about two very large states. Any examples of more medium-sized or smaller states?
The stuff that's been done in other states hasn't been as fundamental or wide-ranging as it's been in Texas and Florida. And I think really one of the reasons for that is there's a lot of amateur legislatures,
Mhm.
and they're paid not that much. It's difficult to master a wide range of subject matter. Um, at other places where serious things have happened, like North Carolina, it's been led by the Board of Regents, not by the legislature. So
Mhm.
there's been a lot of pretty lame DEI bans. For instance, Utah has a lame one, Wyoming has a lame one, that are easily evaded because the legislatures listen to the administrators of schools when they're, constructing the bills, and they kind of fall for traps. And
Mhm.
even though they're warned, they fall for traps. And I like to. I mean, I've gotten to know some of these people decently. I don't think they have bad. Like the legislatures kind of want to do the right thing, but it's just really difficult for them to figure out how to do it. And I always just tell them, do what Florida did. You'll do it better with what you're trying to figure it out. And but they also want to protect their universities. They're proud of the universities. A lot of them are graduates of their universities, and so they haven't completely turned the page on seeing the need for more fundamental reforms.
I think the last part is a bigger problem than the part-time legislature. Again, um, and the fact that oftentimes these people have full-time jobs doing something else. It's not like federal legislating. You're right; they don't have staff to write bills for them. They rely on organizations, either lobbyists or organizations like ACTA or ALEC, and those organizations are not like up to this challenge, or at least I can speak from the that side. I I I think the bigger problem though is what you just said, because the states do legislate well on certain topics, right? For example, on gun rights, the states do legislate well. On taxes, the states do legislate well. So it is a matter of, I think, priorities and political will. But I really I don't know where that hesitancy comes from. I think honestly, both David and Scott have pointed to a kind of warm and fuzzy feeling about their former school, or imagining that these schools are like they were 30 or 40 years ago. I do think that plays a big role. I mean, a more pragmatic problem is that universities are often the biggest employer in their
Hmm.
districts, right? So if the universities shrink, there's going to be an economic problem sometimes. And I'm not saying that that's not a consideration or shouldn't be a consideration in terms of balancing, but ultimately what we're trying to do is to make the education sector, the higher ed sector, actually work for Americans and actually be worthy of the kind of public support that has formed its business model for the last 60 or 70 years. The point is not to destroy it, although I say that often when I'm giving speeches and stuff. I do think that we need, delenda est, we need to destroy the universities, but I mean, as they're currently constituted, we do need somewhere to train the best and brightest, probably smaller percentage of students. We do need an elite in America. We do need somewhere to do groundbreaking research. But I am quite skeptical of the idea that universities are going to change their direction, except for when essentially their money is taken away. I know that there have been some successful reforms in Florida, but it's very institution. It's like a battle. Each institution is an individual battle, and that's. I mean, I don't know that we have quote unquote the manpower for that everywhere. We'll see. Maybe we do, and maybe we need to work on the pipeline of such people that could fight those battles. But on the other hand, we have this huge hammer that's on the federal level and on the state level in funding. Let's just be clear about this. For decades, universities have been operating. Their business model is illegal, right? It's unconstitutional under SFFA, under the Equal Protection Clause. They've violated the First Amendment. I know that fire never tires of talking about all the ways in which they violated the First Amendment. They violate due process provisions in the Constitution. They're operating directly in opposition to the Civil Rights Act, and they're not meeting their obligations under Title VII as an employer. They are definitely they're they're not even allowed. Even the left wing appointees on the EEOC, if you press them hard, will admit that you are not allowed to take race into account at all in hiring and promotion and firing decisions, not even put a thumb on the scale the way for many years was allowed in admissions until the SFFA case. There's no ambiguity about this in the law. It's just they have been allowed to operate contrary to the law for decades, and they're used to doing it. And there's so many ways in which they are just wide open targets for cutting funding. So I really think this is about an attitude change on the state legislative level. It's about, instead of thinking, okay, here's what we've been appropriating to universities, um, for years, it's why should we be appropriating money to universities that are in violation of the Constitution, in violation of federal law, and have all of these pernicious effects and have lost the trust of the American people? No, you university, reform yourself, come back to me with data showing me that what I'm funding is worthwhile. I really do think that this is a necessary attitude change, and it's going to it is happening on the federal level. It would be good if it was happening on the state level too, because like I said, once they have federal funding threatened, they're going to come hat in hand to the state legislatures. That's where they're going to go because they need that money to operate.
Inez, I agree with everything you said, but you left out the biggest obstacle to reform, which is, you mentioned their alums, you mentioned big employer, but then there's the football and the basketball. On the alum status, Americans have a unique emotional attachment. This term alma mater, Ryan, I'm not yet an American, so I guess I can still be perplexed by some American customs. To me, coming from Canada was a very strange one. I looked it up. It means nourishing mother. Like this, wearing college sweatshirts and baseball caps into your 40s and 50s. In a sense, it's beautiful, right? it's American civil life in action. Americans not having a transactional view of a university as a place that gave you a diploma, like I had, where the universities I went to in Canada, and I couldn't care less. Americans donate to them. That's beautiful. But it also creates this emotional attachment that makes it hard to have the critical distance. And then the near fanaticism in some states on the college football or college basketball means that it makes it even harder for a state legislator to want to be a reformer and be an enemy of, Roll Tide or whatever it is. So we're not going to do away with that. I mean, but I think we need to figure out a way to get these state legislators who may be alums, who may be rooting for the football team, to realize that for the good of the university, they need to be more critical of it. For the good of their alma mater, this is where the analogy breaks down, because you shouldn't, slap your mother around. But this nourishing mother needs to be shaken a little bit. And so, fine, you don't necessarily touch the football, but by all means, go after the sociology departments, go after the corrupt humanities, go after the DEI infrastructure, for the good of the university. But there is this big obstacle of this deep emotional attachment that Americans have to the institutions that they went to.
Do you have any any of you really rhetorical tips? Because of course, whenever as these reform efforts proceed, and taking into consideration all of the dangerous pitfalls that may lie in serious higher education reform, some of which David touched on, but everyone has, that is affection for the college, love of the sports team. How should we talk about higher education reform at the state level, or how should legislators talk about it? I mean, is it simply enough to say, look, we're trying to get this weird racialized ideology that's taken over the academy over the last 30 years out of the classroom, and we're trying to pursue excellence? Is that enough, or should we say more things, or say them in different ways?
Well, this does point to a perennial tension in what universities actually do, right? Because we have these two competing notions and they're somewhat in tension. I wouldn't say they're mutually exclusive necessarily, but they're definitely in tension with each other. One is the university as the font of, sort of the Western canon, right? And of truly higher education, creating wiser citizens, right? Creating a class of elites that can guide the country, really. Um, whether that's in business or in government or anything else. And that is a very traditional goal of the universities. That's really what most of them, if you look at most of their founding statements or mottos, right, it all points towards that. Um, on the other hand, we recognize that there's this business element to it, right? That it's about getting a diploma, getting credentialed, um, training, and then even in the higher instance of that, training for the actual jobs that people will do after university. And in some cases, that's still true, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine, for example, like going in to the tech sector without some knowledge of computer science. So in some cases, that's still true. But the kind of convenient way we can sidestep this debate, in my view, is that universities are failing so badly on both counts. It almost doesn't matter which side of that debate you come down on and what you want to see. I think those are problems kind of for another day. Although I think it's worth talking and thinking about them. In terms of messaging, I would say that persuasion doesn't work the way I think a lot of centrists seem to think that persuasion works, right? That you talk reasonably between two people who are, let's say, position A and position B, and you come to something that's in between position A and position B by reason and sort of soft persuasion or conceding certain points. At least in my observation, at least in our times, I think the way that persuasion actually happens in politics is by grabbing the Overton window with both hands, wresting it over, and forcing people to reconsider some of those underlying assumptions that they've essentially looked at the world with for quite some time. And I think we'll be surprised if you look at For example, what Elon Musk has been doing with Doge, um, or even the U.S. aid sort of fight that's going on right now. When you actually force the institutionalists in this case to justify what they're doing, people find out what they're doing. And the reality is that what they're doing is self-evidently unpopular, ideological, and, above all, maybe completely useless. Like that's how it sounds, the average American. So I think that we need to seize the rhetorical high ground on that and force them to justify what they're actually doing. And yes, to David's earlier point, this requires having the data, right? It requires having, in the case of Doge, right, the autistic anons on the internet combing through every U.S. aid grant, right? But we can force universities themselves to produce that data. The legislature can demand it. The trustees can demand it, right? So I do think that mode of argument depends on having that data and being able to point to these programs. You spent $1 million on this absurd DEI thing.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, I think there's always been this tension in what conservatives want out of the universities. So for most of my life, conservatives have complained about the modern university from the perspective of defending the old liberal arts education. And so there's what's going on here, and then there's the old great books or the liberal arts. And what I think is clear is that that's not a strong enough argument, and it's not really sufficient purpose for these modern universities. So that we should first think through what the universities are for. All right. And I put four things down on this. I say universities are about an appreciation for Western Civ, basic numeracy and literacy, professional education, and workforce preparation. And that's what we are about. That's what we want to accomplish, all of these things. Now, not every university needs to accomplish all of these things. We can have liberal arts schools that focus on one thing and don't have law schools or med schools or accounting majors even, or engineering programs. Those are professional education. But a lot of these big state schools are going to have all four of these things on it. And so I think we should get behind the idea that these are the four goals: professional, workforce, Western Civ, basic numeracy, and literacy. And then everything on the university needs to justify its existence in terms of these four things. And if you can't do it, then we have to ask, why are you on the campus? So in my view, lots of programs, lots of departments that are themselves kind of corrupt, you know, try to justify themselves in terms of appreciation of Western Civ. But there's no way sociology needs to be on every campus in the United States because it cannot justify itself in any of these terms. Nor do I think things like anthropology can justify themselves on these campuses. And once you get rid of gender studies, same thing, Black studies, same thing, queer studies, same thing, it's going to be difficult to show that they deserve to be on campuses given these goals. We have to think about what the goals are. And my advice to legislators on this would be to be positive. These are the goals we want our universities to achieve. And then from that, how asking critical questions about whether or not these departments or these administrative practices help foster these things. And notice how I didn't say equity was one of the goals or diversity is one of the goals. So, so So I think it's important to kind of recognize the failures of conservative reform and the way conservatives have talked about this over the course of time, and to adjust accordingly. And I think that's done by kind of mentioning these goals of what the universities are supposed to accomplish.
Scott, can I ask you one question and press you on one of them? You don't think it's a bit pathetic to say basic literacy and numeracy after 16 years of full-time education? I mean, shouldn't we be expecting a little bit more from college grads than basic literacy? And second, what's the difference between your third and your fourth points, the professional development and the workforce preparation?
All right. So the first thing I would say is that basic numeracy and literacy is part of what we would call general education at the universities. And I would like to see students to be able to easily test out of those if they're good enough when they come to the campus, if they've taken calculus, if they can pass basic tests, if they've taken English, if they can pass basic tests, if they've taken literature and history, if they can pass that basic stuff. I'd like them to be able to kind of get out of doing that. And many universities allow that. It is pitiful that that's a goal and that we still have general education on campuses after 12 years of K through 12 school. And we have to say, oh, no, you need a general education. Well, what the heck have you been doing up to that point, right? What have you been doing? Now you're going to get a general education. But like, I'm throwing a sop to that. Like maybe some of the schools aren't good enough. Um, the difference between workforce education and professional education is the way I would judge it. Um, is professional degrees are post-secondary degrees. So lawyers, doctors, theologians are the old triad who would get professional degrees. So you go through all of K through 12, you go through undergraduate, and then you go to professional school. Pharmacists would be in this, dentists would be in this. Whereas workforce education, that's accountants and nurses, people who right from undergraduates can go into their boards and take a job. So that's the distinction I make, and I think we should probably be getting people ready for both those things.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, on the literacy rate, currently only about a third of people with a college degree can read and answer basic questions about a newspaper article. Yeah, I mean, we are starting at a very, very low point, and yes, a lot of blame should be heaped on the K-12 system for this. Uh, but also, it's been in universities' interest because of the incentive set up by the student loan system in this country to admit academically unprepared. I'll modify that dual incentives. One is financial, very like kind of crassly financial. Every student comes with a federal loan check, and universities don't have to worry about whether or not their students, currently at least, can pay back their loans afterwards. But the second thing, of course, is the drive for diversity and DEI. And so, if you're practicing affirmative action, you're reaching lower and lower in terms of standards, academic preparedness standards of the students that you admit, especially if you're not in the top band of universities. But we've simply been admitting too many people to universities. Um, so that is part of that, and it's been real lucrative for universities to get, again, that big federal loan check for every student they admit, even though the 6-year graduation rate overall in our higher ed system is 60%, meaning 4 in 10 students who start every freshman class are not finishing even in 6 years.
But
That's a clear
they don't have the they don't have the diploma, but they have the debt.
right.
As you put it, the
Part of the
university.
debt problem is
Yeah,
people who do not have the bump from having the diploma, and they have 2, 3, sometimes 4 years of student loan expenses from attending university, not to
and
mention
as
not offsetting those years with work. But
and as you put it, Inez, and the universities have no skin in the game.
no.
So they can spit them out after 2, 3, 4 years with no diploma and take in the new crop that bring in the free federal dollars. That's the complete racket, is that we're giving hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans to 18-year-olds who don't know anything with no collateral. And the money is being basically taken by the universities to provide these kids with, at best, a credential and some sort of an education, but more often than not, 4 or 5 years of babysitting with just a non rigorous curriculum, rampant grade inflation, and then at some point, some of these kids can't even hack that. They get spat out of. Ryan made fun of my English. You get spat out of the system. I don't even know how to
Yeah,
say.
that works.
You get spat.
David's
then
English might be wrong, but his point is completely correct, which is that this is a system that has worked really, really well for universities and really
yeah,
badly for everybody else, right?
yeah,
It Private banks would not have made these loans.
never.
Private banks would have made an evaluation that would distinguish between getting a computer science degree from MIT and getting a queer studies degree from a 2000th ranked universities for virtually the same price. But because the government is the loan officer, 93% of the student loans are held and originated by the Department of Education. Now, there is almost no private loan market, okay, in this space. And because of that, it's enabled this business model where essentially the universities can go to every high school graduate in America and say, come on in, take out this money. So I really do push back. I think some conservatives are still really stuck at thinking about the student loan problem and the debt problem from the personal responsibility perspective. And of course, there is a sense in which that's true. These are 18-year-olds, they're legally adults. But I think that really obscures the way the incentives in the system have been aligned primarily through federal loan policy, to make it really, really a business model for universities to just try to trick as many 18-year-olds, no matter how unprepared, how unable to cope with coursework, no matter how useless the coursework is that they're offering these kids, into the university track. And it really has added enormously to the debt crisis.
So let me just jump in here quick on this. So I totally agree with what you guys have said about student loans. And from the perspective of a state legislature, this is a national problem that now they have to deal with. Every student that is going to come to their universities that are sponsored by the state university system or state colleges is eligible for federal loans for free. And the purpose that the state legislatures need to set for themselves, given that fact, is that they have to try to trim down the number of programs that are offered so that everything that is being offered serves a public good that they can defend. And that's why I go back to professional education, workforce education, appreciation for Western Civ, and basic numeracy and scientific literacy, because those at least are things that we know we want out of the universities. And so the states have to deal with the problem that you guys are talking about that is created at the federal level. And they need to do it by intelligently trimming down the number of offerings and making sure that they all pass, I would say, the mission test.
Mhm.
One way
Go ahead, Inez.
legislatures can encourage exactly what Scott is doing is another thing that Texas has done, but it's been a relatively small program that's been in place only for a limited number of degrees. They pioneered the $10,000 degree, right, in Texas universities. That certain degrees just have to be, the total cost has to be $10,000, at Texas public universities. Now, that may not be a reasonable number anymore. This is like legislation from 10, 15 years ago. But whatever that reasonable number is, that may be a really good way of forcing the kind of decisions that Scott is talking about in universities. Because again, I don't think that universities are going to reform this from the inside. I think it's going to have to be the threat, either just of losing funding or of being in violation of state law, that's going to force them to consider those things. So legislation can be written on the state level that simply says, okay, you have to offer a computer science degree. You're a public university, you must offer a computer science. I keep using that example because it seems like something that's clearly, useful. You have to offer a computer science degree for, say, $20,000 over the course of 4 years, and that's all the money you're getting for that program.
How worried do we have to be? Let's try to tackle this one quickly, and then we can finish up with some talk about accreditation. How worried should we be, Scott or Inez or David, about the role of education schools, and how would we reduce their influence on higher ed? I know in K through 12, it's a clear-cut problem, right? There's a whole incentive structure to encourage public K through 12 teachers to go get a master's in education. And for those in our audience who are less familiar with this, with the ed schools, that is either a master's in education or a PhD in education, they've more or less been explicitly dedicated towards anti-Americanism of various flavors since almost they were started, or pretty much in their entire history. They started out as kind of progressive and anti-constitutional in that progressive sense. They've now become much more Marxist or race communistic, if we can use some of the jargon that's floating around the internet and elsewhere today. So how worried should we be, or what steps should be taken at the higher education level to deal with the problem of the education schools?
I actually know something about this. Um,
Yes.
I wrote a report on the Florida University of Florida School of Education. Florida has passed a law that that will prevent schools of education that have identity politics sewn into their curriculum and standards from being able to certify teachers. So
Mhm.
if your program is based around identity politics, you cannot certify teachers. You can still exist as a school of education. You just can't certify teachers.
Mhm.
And the state always has extraordinary powers around who can be certified as a teacher, like the state certifies. And that means it can decertify former certifiers if those former certifiers are bad. And it
Yeah.
can make judgments arbitrarily on that basis. So this law was passed last spring. The rules for it are still being worked out. But the purpose of the report I wrote was to show that basically in 2020, University of Florida School of Education or College Education, can't remember which it is, um, did a revolution in their curriculum. They Floydized their revolution, their curriculum. If you get my drift,
Mhm.
they changed every class into some variant of anti-racism. So they used to have a class called student discipline, and then that changed into restorative justice. And they used to have how to teach social studies, and then it was how to teach social studies to diverse populations. Every class was like that. And so going along with that, I think a very good higher ed reform is to change the way teachers are certified. um, like
Mhm.
open up the number of ways that you can be certified so that you can just have a history degree, or you can just have an English degree, or you can just have a physics degree. You don't have to go through schools of education. And that helps with the job of narrowing down the number of corrupt programs on campus, because among the most corrupt, as you were kind of indicating, Ryan, are those schools of education. And so I think there's a lot of prongs or a lot of policies that are out there to help states tackle the issue of schools of education. My goal would be to get them off of higher ed, and by decertifying their abilities to certify teachers, and finding alternatives to certification.
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
My oh,
Louisiana
go.
has
Yeah.
actually done the state superintendent there, has been exploring a program to allow K-12 teachers to be certified if they have an associate's degree in the subject they're teaching. Um, it's a smart, just to put one concrete proposal out there. I think that one's a really smart one. There is going to be, so as Scott said, you know, schools of ed are the most left-wing part of left-wing campuses, generally speaking. But yes, their entire, kind of purpose is tied to the way that the state certifies K-12 teachers. So, not only can you remove some of those requirements from certification and allow people who demonstrate in whatever way subject mastery, to teach. By the way, this probably will start to bump up against the Griggs decision in the Supreme Court, and the general difficulty in assessing like tests, to employees, generally speaking. So there's some interesting interactions to be looked at there, but generally states can move away from requiring these degrees. They can also stop rewarding them in the pay scale, right?
Right.
Because the pay scale is designed by the legislature. Yes, it's like bargained for by the teachers unions in many cases, but um, policies that, for example, reward professional development, um, that is conducted through schools of ed, that reward teachers with a pay bump when they get a master's of ed from one of these. So it's not just about being able to get into the profession, but being able to advance and to make more money within the profession of teaching. Those things can be decoupled from
Right.
the schools of ed.
All right. So attack it from the supply side and the demand side. Would be a good approach. Well, let's finish up. We're trying to keep this about to an hour by talking about accreditation. I mean, you all know this topic fairly well, but for our listeners or viewers who don't, you have these regional accreditation agencies. If you're any school of higher education, you need to get accredited, which means, I mean, in order to attract students and retain them, you need to have some notion or some endorsement by a body that says you're teaching good things or you're teaching properly and you're properly credentialed. That's the sort of layman's version of accreditation. And of course, these processes are very bureaucratic, and they've placed an increasing emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of your required processes and offerings to get accredited. What are the prospects for reform from the state legislature level, either in individual states or maybe even in states acting in concert? This one's teed up for you, Yenor.
All right, I didn't know. I figured that, but
I'm sure Inez has something to say about it too, and David as
yeah,
well. But
I mean, accreditation is really important. If you're not accredited, you can't get student loans, and you can't send people to professional schools. So, like law schools will only take students from accredited schools. So every school, even Hillsdale, which doesn't take public money, has got to be worried about its accreditation. And there's a kind of accreditation creep that's happened over the course of 100 years since they began accreditation, but especially since the post-war time. Um, what can states do? Well, Florida has what I call the all fronts attack on accreditation. Right now, the time is ripe to do things because the Trump administration is inviting states to become their own accreditors, that the states can accredit their own universities. And so make your own accreditation agency or do it in a compact with other states. Call up the people in Florida or send me an email. I'll connect you with the people in Florida. You can become part of their consortium as they try to establish a state accreditor. Change accreditors. Leave your current accreditor and go to another one that has more flexible standards. That's another good thing that you can do. You can also sue the Department of Education for sitting on accreditation reports or sitting on requests to transfer or even getting involved in accreditation at all, because this should be a state issue, not something that is kind of farmed out by the national government to a public-private partnership that is going to, determine what goes on your campuses in your state. So I think there's lots of opportunities right now because the number one thing that President Trump said he was interested in when it came to higher education was to fire the accreditors. Like on The Apprentice, you're fired, as he said in his little video. And and that means and to establish new accreditors that will do like more serious things. So I think there's just tons of opportunity on this, and because the United States Department of Education is supportive of experimentation in accreditation.
Accreditors are already moving to cover their tracks on this. The one major accreditor in Hawaii and California, which bind together. So yes, this is a state compact potential idea, but one major accreditor has already stripped all the DEI language out of their accreditation forms and replaced it with merit and excellence. Those changes will probably be superficial, but I really like the idea of having just the states directly accredit universities. I think it's something that can be brought in house and therefore have some, establish some kind of like common sense political check, democratic check on the power of these accreditors. But as Scott said, this is something that is being looked at the federal level. I think the field is wide open. Maybe we will have accreditors at least who spring up. And the good thing is, again, you can use Florida standards. You can join a compact with Florida, or you can, you don't have to build everything from scratch. We really only need a couple of these models. But I look forward to a future in which accreditors of universities are more concerned about the 60% 6-year graduation rate that we were talking about, or the 31% literacy rate, functional literacy rate among college graduates than they are about diversity numbers.
Yeah, and I on a closing note, although if anyone has closing thoughts, please offer them. I'll just say, in a general, universal or atmospheric sense, I think state legislators should think ambitiously about this project. The stakes are very high. I mean, part of the story of the decline of Western civilization and America, a big part of it has been the corruption of and the ideological capture of our educational system. So, if you want to save your country and save the future of freedom in the West, there's no better place to start than at the state education level. And state legislators should take more control of this issue, should talk about it in a high-toned way, and should collaborate with their allies across sympathetic states and sympathetic legislatures. And it's good work to be doing, and it's very important work. So I'm glad you all joined us to talk about it. And I'm glad everyone joined us to listen. So this, again, is our Cincinnatus series, which we're going to record weekly for the next 5 or 6 weeks or so, a special edition of the Roundtable podcast. And soon we'll be completely a vidcast, although we're starting with this vidcast. We'll start recording everything by video. And it's produced by the Claremont Institute. I've been your host, Ryan Williams. I'm the president of the Claremont Institute. If you want to learn more about our work, go to claremont.org. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. And you should especially go to dc.claremont.org if you are a state legislator. All of Scott's reports are housed on that website. He's done them on probably a dozen states at this point, and a few states have gotten the 2 or 3 times treatment from Scott on these are meant to be resources for you all to look at the current state of public education and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and hopefully will be a guide for you on how to reform it. So thank you all for listening and watching, and we'll stay tuned here for more of this stuff. And thanks, Scott, David, and Inez.